Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're super excited that you're here with us today, celebrating the civil rights movement. We're going to be talking about civil rights really throughout American history. It's going to be a lot of fun. Do me a favor, friends. Please help me test out the chat and make sure that you can use the chat, pop in any questions, comments, anything that you'd like. If you want, you can start with where you're tuning in from, how the weather is, if you'd like to share with us that, and then who you're watching with. I don't know about you and where you all are, but it is a kind of a chilly morning here in Northern California. So a little gray, a little cold. Wynn, what's it like in Philly?
It was very rainy yesterday, so I'm hoping that the sun will come out at some point today, but it is very, very cold. Very frigid, I would say.
Very frigid. Yikes. Well, I'm sorry. Although I do miss the snow. Like I would like some snow. That would be lovely.
Well, we haven't had much of that either.
That's what Brian was saying on Wednesday. He was telling us that it was projected to be potentially like a very snowlessness winter and spring.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see. And Michael's back to tell us that it's sunny in San Diego. Michael, only a little bit jealous. That's awesome. Cold in Ohio. Yikes, Tip City. Oh, sorry, Cynthia. It's nice that your students have the day off today. That's very exciting. Hopefully they're out and enjoying the weather, the cold, the snow. And Pat, very nice. Welcome to our friends in Fairfax, Virginia. Also chilly in Metro Washington. Very nice. I feel like that's fairly typical of January here, although everybody in either Southern California or Florida likes to pop in and tell us that they have it lovely there. Michelle, you're also in Philly. A little chilly, a little cold in Philly, chilly in Philly. Totally understand that. I love when everybody tells us where they're tuning in from. Seattle. Oh, Tanya, very nice. More West Coast represented. Cold and rainy. I feel like, yeah, that's pretty on message, right? On brand. Hello, Miss Berlin's class from Philly. Hello, hello. Oh, hello. Very exciting. Patty from Arlington, Texas, watching with your 8-month-old golden retriever. That is awesome. I hope that you and golden retriever learn something. This is going to be a lot of fun. I wish we could all have our pets on and watch these. That would be so much fun. A little chaotic, but fun. Bruce, you're in North Carolina and it's cold. Totally understand. Icy in Toronto. Yikes, Patricia. We believe you. Absolutely. It's on my list though, Patricia. I would like to visit someday. I haven't been yet, but I would really like to. We've got about 2 minutes until go time. So thank you, friends, for testing out the chat for us and letting us know where you're tuning in from and who you're tuning in with. That's always very fun for us to see. We've got about 1 minute until go time, but really excited for this virtual tour. Wynn is actually live at the center and going to be taking us through our story of We the People, which is an incredible exhibit. A lot of ground, like 250 years of American history in there, but we're going to be focusing specifically on the fight for civil rights. So it's going to be a good tour. Let us know if you have questions, and we're really excited to get started. We've got 1 more minute. Hello to our friends in South Louisiana. It is cold, 59 degrees there. I know some other people in this chat are like, 59? Come on, that's like bathing suit weather. Like, let's go swimming. Third block. Hello, everybody. Super excited to have you here. All right, it's almost time to get started. Everybody get excited. This is one of my favorite tours that we offer here. And Wynn is just going to knock it out of the park. I know it. So it is almost time to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and begin to record. Let's get started, everyone. Hello and welcome to the National Constitution Center. My name is Madison. I'm a member of the center's education team, and I'm so excited that you're all here and joining us today on this I think this is the last Friday in January, where we're going to be talking all about civil rights. Also joining me today is the incredible Wynn. Wynn is one of our museum educators at the National Constitution Center, and Wynn has a very fun job. They're going to be taking us through our main exhibit called The Story of We the People and showing us this fight for civil rights, not just in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but really showing us where it begins in the nation's founding and this fight for civil rights throughout the centuries. So we have a lot of ground to cover. If you have questions for me or Win, please feel free, pop those in the chat or the Q&A. We are here and happy to help. But Win, I know you have a lot to do and a lot to cover, so I'm going to officially turn it over to you. And friends, enjoy the tour.
Well, thank you, Madison. Absolutely. As Madison mentioned, I am here live at the National Constitution Center. You can see the giant preamble wall here behind me that begins, of course, with these famous 3 words that start off the Constitution of the United States, we the people. And that's sort of going to be our theme for this guided tour today, is what is we the people? Who are we? Who is the people? And how does that definition change over time? How does it become expanded and become more inclusive of the population of the United States? So as Madison mentioned, my name is Wynn. I'm one of the museum educators here, and we're going to be walking through our main exhibit here at the center. It is a big, long timeline of constitutional history, starting with the Revolutionary War and goes all the way up to nowadays in 2023. So we have a lot to cover, and I really want to jump into it. We're going to start by moving away from the preamble wall. And although we love to start with the Constitution here at the National Constitution Center, you can probably guess why, we're going to go back a little further and start with sort of the founding principles here in our country. And there's a very famous document that really kickstarts a lot of these ideas, these principles that we call them. And it was written in 1776. I'm sure you know what this document is. If you haven't guessed it yet, it's the Declaration of Independence. Now, written in 1776, it has those famous words, all men are created equal. And of course, that's what we're going to try and embody, that all men are truly created equal. But it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, right from the start, some people are recognizing some problems with this not living up to this ideal of equality. In January of 1776, there was a free Black man who lived in Boston, Massachusetts. His name was Prince Hall. And he actually wrote a petition to the Massachusetts state legislature that asked Massachusetts to abolish the institution of slavery. His reason? It went against the principles of the American Revolution. It went directly against this line in the Declaration of Independence that all men are truly created equal. And Massachusetts actually listened. And in 1783, they officially abolished slavery in the United States, or excuse me, slavery in their state, I should say, in the state of Massachusetts. And that was a big accomplishment, but it didn't really work out nationwide. In fact, the institution of slavery was left up to each state. And in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, when the delegates came here to Philadelphia, they met at Independence Hall, which is right across the street behind this wall from me. They had a lot of debates, right? They had a lot of things to cover. How was our government going to function? How was it going to be set up? And one thing that they just couldn't seem to solve was the issue of slavery. So the word slavery is never actually written into the Constitution at all. But that doesn't mean that they didn't talk about it, that they didn't make references to it, because they definitely did. You may have heard of the infamous 3/5 compromise that said, for the purposes of counting population for our state legislatures and our Congress, each enslaved person would only count as 3/5 of a total person. They also wrote into law some things about the Fugitive Slave Act and the slave trade and how we're not allowed to touch it until 1808, internationally at least. So although slavery didn't appear in the words of the Constitution, there was still a lot going on behind the scenes and a lot of references to it in the document itself. And this institution of slavery, through those references, becomes sort of embedded into our nation. And although it was left up to each state, we'll see slowly that a lot of divisions start to arise. And out of this division comes a movement called abolition, which really started back here with Prince Hall. He was trying to abolish the institution of slavery. And we'll see as we go further down the timeline that other folks would join him in that mission as well. So as we head out of the revolutionary era, you can see down our timeline here, We are passing the drafting, the creation of the Constitution in 1787, and we're starting to pick up on that divisiveness. So when you think of this concept of we the people in the Constitution, of course, we're all trying to live up to this concept, but it doesn't really work out in reality, as I mentioned. There were many folks that were discriminated against, that were not considered citizens of the United States, that were not included in this idea of we the people. And out of this arises, as I mentioned, some really strong abolitionists who would essentially create an entire movement to get this definition of we the people truly expanded and becoming more inclusive. So we are stopping here now, right before the Civil War, right? Country is extremely divided. And there are a lot of people on both sides advocating for many different things, advocating for states' rights, advocating for the institution of slavery, and advocating for the abolishment of slavery. There was a really important man who in 1829 wrote a really famous document. His name was David Walker. He was from North Carolina, a free Black man. And he wrote the Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And in this document, he talked about how slavery is an injustice upon the people, specifically upon the American people. And he really kickstarted a huge movement in the country that had really started in 1776, but started to pick up speed in the mid 1800s. Excuse me. You have abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator, that published famous abolition speeches from across the country so that folks all across the United States could hear them speak. People like Frederick Douglass, who referred to the Constitution as the Great Liberty Document and used many legal ways and written ways to try to get the word out there. And then you have people like this man here, get you a good view of him behind me. So if anyone recognizes him, feel free to drop it in the chat here. I'll give you a hint that his name is listed up there. So if you really want to cheat, it's up there. This is Dred Scott. So Dred Scott and his wife, Harriet Scott, were enslaved folk that were living in, nowadays it would be Minnesota. So if you know your geography really well, you can tell me, is Minnesota north or south? North, right? So most people assume that it would be free territory. It's way up there, like pretty far north, as far as you can go, almost to our friend in Toronto. And in fact, it was free territory, but Dred and Harriet were still living as enslaved folk. So you can see sort of where the problems arise here. In fact, Dred and Harriet would draft a petition and send it, saying that they should be free people. Now, this petition would pend in our court system for 11 long years. Very, very long time to wait and see what your fate will be. And eventually it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where in 1857, they ruled, in fact, that the Scots had no rights to freedom. They went even further. The Supreme Court was headed at that time by Chief Justice Roger Taney, and he declared that the Scots really have no rights. They are not citizens of the United States according to the Constitution. They didn't even have a right to petition the courthouse and didn't even have a right to be present in the courthouse. He said, and I quote, "The Scots have no rights to which the white man is bound to respect." Now, this was widely considered to be one of the worst Supreme Court decisions of all time, and it definitely further accelerated our country towards civil war, as there was so much infighting between people in their own families, in their states, in one country. And this, of course, leads us directly into one of the most tumultuous times in the United States history, the Civil War. And as we head into the Civil War, 3 million soldiers would be fighting, with 750,000 of them would pass away. And many of them were fighting for this stronger inclusion, this idea of we the people. And it was all headed, of course, by the great Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, who was attempting to keep the Union together as best as he can. And he was successful. Now, after the Civil War came a really interesting era in American history. We call it Reconstruction. And it's really exactly what it sounds like. We were attempting to reconstruct the Union, rebuild this United States almost from scratch, because the Civil War left both sides completely devastated, especially the South. And in this Reconstruction era, it's also known as the nation's second founding, because there were three really important amendments that came out of it that would absolutely change the trajectory of our nation for the entire time. Now, the first was the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, pretty simply abolishes the act of slavery in the United States. With one exception, you can still be enslaved as punishment for a crime. That's the only loophole that's still in the 13th Amendment there. But this accomplishes what many folks like Prince Hall and David Walker were asking for just decades earlier. Now, the 14th Amendment expanded that. It actually wrote the promises of equality from the Declaration, that idea that all men are created equal, into the Constitution itself, put it into law, put it into a statute. And the 14th Amendment would very quickly become the most cited amendment out of all of them by the Supreme Court. So it's really, really important. It defines what a citizen is. It gives birthright citizenship. It establishes the protection clause, the equal clause. So many great things came out of that one singular amendment. And the 15th Amendment actually takes a step further. It declares that your right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So it expanded these voting rights to these newly freed slaves, these African American men. You notice I say men, because women would actually not gain the right to vote until many, many decades later, in the 1900s. So keep your brains on that, because we'll come back to that point in a little bit. But this second founding, this nation's second founding, was an absolute triumph. But that doesn't mean that it didn't come with a lot of backlash. In fact, there was so much backlash. There was voter intimidation, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, black codes, the Jim Crow segregation era, all of these things that really rolled back a lot of Reconstruction and what it attempted to do. And one of the most important rollbacks that we'd love to talk about at the Constitution Center, because it's just so important to understand where we came from, is the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, this Supreme Court decision is pretty famous. You might recognize the name Rosa Parks, if that rings a bell. So pre-Rosa Parks, we had a man named Homer Plessy, and he was riding a train car that said whites only. He was a black man, a free black man, and he refused to leave and was arrested. Now, this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where Supreme Court decided against Homer Plessy. They said that separate but equal is okay here in the United States. And that really set a precedent for a lot of the court cases that we're going to talk about a little bit further down the timeline. So, as we head out of the Reconstruction era, I think it's really important to remember that although we made such amazing progress in our nation so far, with the changing of these amendments and adding to the Constitution, expanding this definition of we the people, progress is not always linear. It changes, right? It's an ebb and flow, push and pull back and forth between different eras of people who are fighting for rights. And we can see that in Reconstruction, as we made such amazing progress, expanded this definition, and still we saw some drawbacks, some rollbacks of these protections, and some new changes that state governments were making. But as we head into this new century here in the United States, we see more prominent leaders emerging, like Ida B. Wells, one of my favorite characters in American history. Ida B. Wells was a woman in Illinois who marched in the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade. And when she did so, the parade was segregated. Now, she was a Black woman. She was told to march in the back, but she refused to do so. She broke ranks and marched right in the front with her delegation in Illinois. She would be joined by people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who would create the NAACP in 1909. All of these new leaders were emerging. And as we head into perhaps the most famous era of civil rights history, the 1950s and the 1960s, we can see this movement really reaching its peak. One that started all the way back in the 1700s with men like Prince Hall, coming to a head here in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, I have this video that you see behind me here with our school desks, and we'll talk about why they're here exactly. But just keep an eye on that video. You might see some famous faces while we're talking. So beginning even in the 1930s, there were NAACP lawyers like Thurgood Marshall, William Hastie, Charles Hamilton Houston, who would fight for overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. They said that separate cannot mean equal, and they attempted to end racial discrimination in our federal government and also in private businesses and entities, things like restaurants, hotels, public restrooms, things like that. And they would really attempt to get Plessy v. Ferguson essentially thrown out. The Supreme Court needed to overturn this for any progress to really be made. Now, they actually did this because there was a really famous court case in 1954 called Brown v. Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. And that's sort of what our school desks represent here. Because if you know anything about this case, it's about a third grader. Her name is Linda Brown. Now, she wanted to go to school in a school that was closer to her house, so she could walk there easily in the morning, instead of crossing the railroad tracks all the way to the other side of town. She was a young Black girl, and she was denied entry to this school. Their school was segregated. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court once again, where this new court, this slightly more forward-thinking court, headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren. We call this the Warren Court. You'll get a good picture of him in just a minute. They actually did what most people think they never would. They overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. They threw that statute out the window and wrote Brown v. Board of Education that said, separate is inherently unequal. Separate can never be equal. And they ended segregation in our public schools. So Linda Brown was able to attend whatever school she wanted to. And this led, of course, to a lot of tensions. You might know the story of the famous Little Rock Nine, those 9 students in Little Rock, Arkansas, who attempted to desegregate Central High School. And they did so successfully, but definitely not without a fight. It took a lot of bravery to overcome verbal abuse, physical violence, and all of those really intense messages that were sent to them. But they did so really successfully. And luckily, desegregation would really start to happen. But of course, again, it wasn't all without a fight. We have people arising like Rosa Parks, who I mentioned earlier, who began the Montgomery bus boycotts, which lasted well over a year, even though they were supposed to only last one day, where she refused to give up her seat and others did so following in her footsteps. And eventually those buses in Montgomery were desegregated. She was very successful. We also have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where many students who are probably the age of some of you watching or just a little bit older would have nonviolent sit-ins where they'd go to lunch counters, to delis, to soda shops, and they would sit peacefully, refusing to move from the whites-only sections, despite an intense amount of abuse. But they did so very, very bravely. And thanks to them, many of those areas became desegregated. And coming out of this emerged many famous leaders. Rosa Parks, as we mentioned, John Lewis as well, and perhaps the most famous of the time period, which I'm sure you will all recognize his portrait, and I will show you it right here. Anyone recognize him? He's pretty famous. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. would emerge out of this Montgomery bus boycott era and become one of the most famous and prominent civil rights leaders in our nation's history. The picture that we have here is him giving his speech in 1963, for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, in which he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which of course has those famous words in it. And he talks about how these promises from the Declaration of Independence were written for all Americans, for we the people. I want to get you a good look at one of the quotes that we have from this speech. You can see it right there. It says, "When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. We have come to cash this check." This speech made a huge impact on our nation, and it was really successful. It was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, of course, sort of following in the footsteps of the man who attempted to keep our nation together back during the Civil War. And coming out of this March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, we enter a really amazing era of legislation changes. So I want to get you a good look at the man who we mentioned earlier, Chief Justice Earl Warren. There he is in all his glory. I quite like his glasses. I think they almost match mine. Now, Chief Justice Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. We call his court the Warren Court. It lasted from 1953 to 1969, and it was a really progressive court, at least for the time. Now, they ruled on some really famous cases like Miranda v. Arizona, Brown v. Board of Education, of course, Gideon v. Wainwright, and started solidifying these individual rights. He's very famous for having the one man, one vote court. And Justice Earl Warren would be instrumental in passing these new legislations and these new laws in the United States. And Congress during this time would also participate. They passed the famous Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended racial discrimination in a variety of settings: work, school, restaurants, train cars, public buses, anything like that. This was a huge step forward, and it was what Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of these later civil rights movement leaders were really pushing for. But of course, as we mentioned, progress is never linear, and there was backlash to this as well. Perhaps the most famous was the Selma incident, where on March 7th, 1965, some protesters who were asking to pass the later Voting Rights Act of 1965 were met with extreme violence by police. Media was there and covered it, and people were horrified by the things that they saw. And it did lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed, which gave further protections to those who were trying to vote here in the United States. The 24th Amendment was passed, which banned poll taxes here in the United States. And all of these little bits of progress started to really come together in the 1960s. But of course, progress is never linear, as I keep mentioning, and they would still face backlash. But the most important thing is that they kept fighting, and they continue to fight. Although the 1960s is really the height of the civil rights era, this is definitely not where it ended. People across the United States would continue to fight for civil rights throughout the rest of our nation's timeline and history. And this era that started all the way back in 1776 with the promises of all men are created equal continues to this very day, as we in the United States attempt to expand this definition of we the people to live up to the promises of the principles of the revolution, to make sure that all people feel included, all people have their rights, including the right to vote here in the United States. And if you remember my question from earlier, women wouldn't gain that right to vote until 1920. So it took quite a long time, but we did it. And that's really the important thing, is that we keep fighting, we keep pushing. These prominent civil rights leaders and people who are just like you kept on fighting. They kept working towards civil rights and expanding this definition of we the people. And as we head back to the beginning of our timeline here, I always love that this exhibit is a big circle, because time really is very linear. Not to get all Albert Einstein on you, but there's always this notion that history repeats itself. And as we head back to the beginning of our timeline here, I'll get you a nice look at where we started and what we are attempting to live up to, right? This idea of we the people. And that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on this journey. We covered 250 years of history in just under 30 minutes. So I left you a few minutes if you have any questions for me, or if you have any questions for Madison, we are absolutely here for you.
Thank you so much, Wynn. That was an incredible walkthrough of civil rights throughout the centuries. And when, like you mentioned, my favorite part about this exhibit too is that it's a circle, right? It's very linear the way that we progress chronologically throughout history. But as you showed us, this fight and this push and pull for civil rights is exactly that. It's a push and a pull. We make progress and then it wanes, but we make progress again because we never give up, and then it wanes a little bit again. So thank you for showing us this fight for civil rights and how we can kind of keep making our way, making the good fight, and keep fighting for those civil rights. I don't think we have any questions yet, so I'm going to officially end this recording. But don't worry, friends, Wynn and I are going to stick around and we will answer your questions in just a moment. All right, everyone. Oh, Wynn, it looks like we've got our first question here. Oh, Serenity would like to know how long it took to build this exhibit. A very good question. This exhibit opened when the Constitution Center opened July 4th, 2003. So we're coming up on our 20th birthday. So this exhibit is about 20 years old. Hope that helps, Serenity. And then Josh, I see that you're asking how long was the civil rights movement? And I think, Josh, what we can kind of argue and what we can kind of learn from Wynn's fantastic tour is that, you know, a lot of us tend to think of it as, oh, it's the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but not really, right? If you go all the way back to the beginning of the nation's founding, you see that really it began centuries ago, this idea of pushing for equality and these rights. So I think you could argue that it's kind of spanned throughout American history. But of course, we do know that the civil rights movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s is where all of this kind of progress, all of this fighting and pushing and pulling, kind of, it all coalesced, it all came together during this time period that produced this kind of incredible landmark legislation, these decisions of the Warren Court. You know, it all comes together during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but it had started a long, long time ago. Any other questions, friends? And you know what, Caitlin, I do see you and Warren kind of make the same point. Caitlin wants to know, I'm sorry, Misha wants to know, are we still fighting as hard for civil rights now as we were back then? And that kind of ties into Warren's point too, is that it's still going on, right? This idea that progress is we've never just attained, you know, those principles of the American Revolution. We always have to keep fighting, keep pursuing. I think that's a great point, Misha. So I guess my question for you would be, do you think we're still fighting, or how are we still fighting today to secure these civil rights? Any other questions, friends? Wynn, I'll ask you a question. Who is your favorite figure of the civil rights movement throughout the centuries? Do you have a favorite?
That's a really interesting question. You know, I am fascinated by the story of Claudette Colvin. I don't know if anyone has heard of Claudette Colvin, but she was a fascinating character. And I love her because I learned about her when I was the same age as her. So Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old who actually did what Rosa Parks did. She refused to give up her seat on a public bus and was arrested for it. And she really inspired a lot of people like Rosa Parks to follow in her footsteps. Now, Claudette Colvin was really young. She was 15 years old. She was also pregnant at the time. And so a lot of civil rights leaders thought that she might not be able to handle the pressure that comes with being the leader of a civil rights movement. So Rosa Parks sort of did that in her stead. But I love her story that she, at 15 years old, inspired so many other people to do what she just felt was right.
Absolutely. I love her story too, because it really does showcase too that we tend to think of this movement from like the leaders and like the top down and the big names. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm wearing my Rosa Parks earrings today. But, you know, we have like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, you know, all of these incredible figures. But some of the lesser known figures are the ones that we love to learn about, because it starts too with everybody. It's a grassroots movement. You have students who are involved, you know, at sit-ins and boycotts. You know, everybody is kind of participating in this movement. It's not just kind of those big names that we tend to associate with the civil rights movement, but it's everybody. And I think that's really cool. You know, we talked about Ruby Bridges as well, who was quite young when, you know, she makes her debut into the civil rights movement scene, but it's everybody. So Wynn, thanks for bringing up Claudette, because I think her story is equally as amazing. And I love when we get to talk about her. All right, friends, it looks like we have time for one more question. And I'll pin this one back to you as well. We have from our friends at Gate Magnet Middle School in Michigan, what are some of the important artifacts that we have in our collection? Maybe that tie to the civil rights movement, or Win, some of your favorite artifacts that we have on display too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I can think of a couple right off the top of my head. One of the really cool artifacts I think we have is we actually have a poll tax receipt from the 1930s in Texas. And it looks kind of like a really old-timey receipt, but you can see how much it exactly cost on there. And I think it's really important for people to see that, because a lot of times we think of poll taxes as like, oh, you throw $1 down and you get to vote. But sometimes they were really expensive. And I think the one that we have right now was really, really expensive. It would be closer to like $40 or $50 if you wanted to vote nowadays with that same tax. And it's really cool that we get to have an original poll tax here. I also really love, we passed it a little bit earlier down our timeline. We have an original signature from Abraham Lincoln when he was giving the Gettysburg Address. The story goes that a young girl went around to all the people who gave speeches that day and asked for their autograph. And so we have Abraham Lincoln's original signature in our exhibit, which I think is pretty cool to get to look at every day.
That's amazing. Those are some of my favorites too. I love those. One that I'll add to is we have, and friends, you'll get to see it next month because we're going to be taking tours of our Civil War and Reconstruction exhibit, which is downstairs in the museum. But we have a ballot box. It was kind of like a cobbled together, last minute, kind of dilapidated looking, green minty colored box, essentially kind of like a cardboard box that was made to be one of the first ballot boxes that Black men would have cast their votes into. It's not like professional looking in any way. It just is kind of like a green, almost looks like a cereal box in size. And it has like a little cutout on the top, and we'll see it next month too. But on top of it, it says colored. They wrote down that this is the ballot box for Black men to use. It's one of those artifacts that really shocks you when you see it, because it shows you that this would have been like one of the first ballot boxes in the history of the country that Black men would have finally been able to use to cast their votes. So it's an incredibly moving piece, and Win and I will probably show it to you again next month. It's a really fun one, and you'll get to see it when we do that tour. But we have so many more artifacts to show you next month, which is going to be a lot of fun. Now, friends, I think we're just at about out of time. So I want to, again, thank Win so much for sharing your time and expertise. This has been such a fun tour, and I feel like we learn so much every time you join us. So huge thank you to Win. Huge thank you to all of you for tuning in on this fabulous last Friday in January, celebrating the fight for civil rights. And we hope to see you next time. So stay tuned for an email from me for more upcoming programs, and we will see you again soon.